Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a favorite of ours here at the Majority Report, here to discuss his latest piece on the Saudi Arabian and Iranian normalization agreement. Trita, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So this is major. Iran, Saudi Arabia, they've come to a normalization agreement. The parameters are arguably less significant than how the agreement was actually reached and who helped them reach it. It was brokered by China, and there was no United States involvement. Take us through the signage of this agreement last week.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, you're quite right. As it stands right now, this deal in and of itself is smaller than the fact that China stepped in and mediated it. Iran and Saudi Arabia have had good and bad relations, up and down, for many, many different years. And now we've had a 7-year slump, and that seems to have now come to an end. But there's not going to be a love fest. At least the normalization deal in itself doesn't guarantee that. Instead, they're going to continue to be rivals. But because of the normalization, that rivalry is now going to be much better managed. And that hopefully will then mean that they're not going to be recklessly spreading their rivalry throughout the region and turning other countries into an arena for their conflict. So that is fantastic news for most countries in the region, of course, assuming that things will go through as planned. It can lead to something bigger. It can lead to a much bigger strategic shift, but that is a much greater unknown at this point. But the fact that China stepped in and mediated this is extremely significant. Now, the Chinese were not alone. The Iraqis and the Omanis had been mediating and preparing the ground for this since 2019. But they couldn't really push it over the goal line. The Chinese came in and did that. And there were some apparently pretty intense negotiations just in the last couple of weeks, from Xi visiting Riyadh, and then later on Raisi went to Beijing. So the Chinese role seems to have been quite significant, at least towards the end. And this is huge because China has traditionally not desired to play that type of a role in the Middle East. It was almost a given that China would never get itself involved in these different things. And now it's been successful, and it's sending shockwaves, not just in the Middle East, but it's also raising question marks as to whether China's proposed mediation in Ukraine should be taken far more seriously than it was 2 or so weeks ago when it was first proposed and very quickly dismissed by Western powers.
Well, that dismissal it colors it entirely differently, right? Because there's some parallels with this situation here, where the United States has been unable to mediate any kind of relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran because it is so hawkish on Iran, right? They do not have really a leg to stand on from the Iranians' perspective. Now, Russia invaded Ukraine. It's an asymmetrical situation, but at the same time, China is positioning itself as a more neutral diplomatic power in this way. I mean, what is their end game? Obviously, now they have kind of developed a relationship between these two major oil powers in the region and has cooled tensions between the two, at least for now. What do you see as their the goal of their kind of shift on past history of diplomacy or lack thereof?
So let me address the goals second. Let me first talk about what you addressed first in your question, which is, how come the US couldn't do it and the Chinese could? It's not just that the US is being very hostile towards Iran and vice versa. It's also what Khalid Eljabri and I write in Foreign Affairs yesterday. It's also because the United States, both under Trump and under Biden now, has been completely deferential to the Saudis. We're trying to hug MBS to death. So we lost credibility in the region, partly because we're part of all of these different conflicts instead of being neutral. And then secondly, because we've just completely bent over backwards for some of these states, which has then further embroiled us in their conflicts and further undermined any credibility we had to mediate. Now, I don't think that the United States easily could have mediated between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the first place. We could have, had Trump not pulled out of the JCPOA and we actually had 7 years of steadily improving relations with Iran, then it could be in a very different universe than we are right now. But obviously, Trump made sure that that didn't happen. But I think it goes beyond Iran and Saudi Arabia. The United States is not a trusted mediator in most parts of the Middle East. It's not just Iran and Saudi Arabia. And part of that is because
Israel-Palestine.
Israel-Palestine is the biggest example. I was going to get to that because we've actually made a point out of not being neutral. Remember back in the 1990s, Al Gore got a lot of criticism because he at some point had said that we would be an honest broker in the Middle East. It was some of the most hawkish pro-Israel voices that attacked him and said, no, America's going to be on the side of Israel. It's not going to be an honest broker. Honest broker means that we're neutral. We're not neutral. We shouldn't be neutral. Well, guess what? Not being neutral has meant over a course of years now that we have lost any credibility to be a trusted mediator. And perhaps we didn't see that as a particularly costly position because we were the only games in town. Now there is another game in town. And now suddenly we're seeing the cost of the United States branding itself as a partisan actor in the region, as someone who's on the side. It's not mediating, it's essentially Saudi Arabia's lawyer in the mediation between the Saudis and the Houthis. It's not an honest broker. We don't want to be an honest broker. Well, guess what? That's going to cost us a lot now because now the Chinese are stepping in. Now, what do the Chinese want? Well, first and foremost, countries do all of these different things because it's in their own interests. I wish we did it more that way, because if we're acting our own interest, there's so much in the Middle East and elsewhere that we wouldn't be doing. But China's doing this out of its own interest, and its key interest is that it needs to have stability in the Middle East because half of its energy is coming from the Middle East. And growing its economy, bringing millions of Chinese out of poverty is the most important objective for the Chinese. By stepping in and reducing the tension between the Saudis and the Iranians, it's stabilizing oil markets, it's reducing the risk premium, and it's good for its economy. But it's also probably doing it for one other reason, or many other reasons, but one that I would want to mention is the fact that the Chinese are also doing this because it brings Iran and Saudi closer to them. And if US-Chinese tensions continue to rise, which they have been since the Trump years and continued under Obama, the Chinese want to make sure that in such a scenario, the United States is not going to be able to put pressure on Saudi Arabia to cease its energy relations with China, for instance. They want to have a guarantee by bringing the Saudis closer to them. And by doing this, they're also showing that China can be a constructive player on the international scene, which will make it much more difficult for the United States to brand China as a threat to the global order, as the new pacing threat that we have to go into a Cold War against. So China's doing it for its own reasons, obviously. What I think took everyone by surprise is the speed and the competence in which they managed to shift from being a country that stays out of these things to a country that is stepping in, mediating, and bringing it to a close.
Well, as you say, I mean, they were uniquely situated to do so based on their economic prowess and the fact that they were relatively neutral and had interest in this situation. And the United States has completely gotten rid of its credibility in the region. It's been, and Murtaza Hussain wrote about this in The Intercept, that the United States' role as an enforcer for, say, Saudi Arabia or Israel has not just burned its credibility with other countries, but it has also incentivized the countries that we have close relationships with to pursue aggressive military conquest or aggression, apartheid in Israel's instance, on their own because we were their enforcer behind the scenes. So it isn't just our impartiality that has created and helped exacerbate this mess, some of the messes that we see, but it's just the nature of how the U.S. wields power, which is very different than this kind of soft power strategy from China, one that I would wish the United States would pursue. And I think clearly demonstrating here that if your stated objective is actually coming to some sort of agreement, it's much more effective, obviously.
Yeah, and those two things are very connected, of course, because it is our desire not to be impartial, which also means that we have given carte blanche to many of the states in the region to do whatever they want. And when they get themselves into trouble, which they invariably do, they count on us to have an obligation to come and bail them out. And that's what we've done with the Saudis in Yemen. That's what we're continuously doing as Israel continues to expand its occupation, illegal settlements, erode its own democracy in the process. None of this, in my view, would really been able to happen had we not enabled it to happen by thinking that we're actually doing them a favor by supporting such policies that they're pursuing. In fact, a key reason as to why Saudi Arabia has shifted towards diplomacy with Iran is precisely because under Trump, they got a wake-up call because the Iranians attacked Saudi oil fields. The Saudis expected the United States to come and bomb Iran in retaliation as part of a long-standing policy dating back to the Carter years, the Carter Doctrine. And Trump explicitly said, I'm not going to go to war with Iran on behalf of Saudi Arabia. This was another moment of shock in Saudi Arabia, and they suddenly realized they can't hide behind American power as they could before. Well, if you can't hide behind America's military might, guess what? Diplomacy with your neighbors suddenly become much more attractive. And in that sense, our policy has actually been an obstacle to the regional diplomacy that we now are seeing happening for the last couple of years. And the reason why it's happening again is because more and more states have become convinced we are leaving the region. Even if we keep military forces in the region, we don't have the appetite to fight in or for the region. And as a result, they can't hide behind us, and they need to resolve their own tensions themselves and build their own security with their neighbors themselves. And guess what? That's actually a really good thing. Not just for them, it's good for us as well. All we need to do now is to encourage it more, make sure that it moves in a stable way instead of being disruptive, and bring American troops home.
But the fear probably from the Biden administration is that, oh my gosh, our major buddy that we've completely, bent over backwards to, kiss the ring of MBS or bump the fist rather, they are becoming close to our arch rival. And the United States has been, and I think, we've done a few interviews on this, I'm immensely concerned that the Biden administration's being reckless in its China hawkery with these deals with Australia, the reopening of military bases in the Philippines, the consistent hawkishness to drum up this rivalry. I mean, that I would imagine also motivates China. But when it comes to the Saudis, why are Biden's appeals that are embarrassing, honestly, from a progressive perspective, where he says we're going to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state and then he's cozying up to MBS? Why are they falling on deaf ears with Saudi Arabia? Like, why has the regime in Saudi Arabia, despite the U.S.'s consistent, forgiving of its misdeeds and human rights abuses, choosing to kind of say, well, I want to dance with another?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And it goes back to what we talked about before. First, you have the US say, hey, we're not going to fight for you. And then the Saudis start to, well, then they have to start looking elsewhere. They're doing diplomacy with Iran. They're moving closer to China. Then we got a panic. Somewhere in the summer after the withdrawal of Afghanistan, there was a major change happening in the White House. Originally, there were plans to actually withdraw a significant amount of troops from the Middle East. Then that suddenly was completely changed. And the winning argument in the NSC was, well, we're going to have this major confrontation or competition with the Chinese. And that competition is not going to take place in the South China Sea alone. It's going to take place in Africa, in Europe, in Latin America, and in the Middle East. And as a result, we cannot withdraw troops. We cannot weaken our relations with these partners. However problematic those relations have been. Instead, we have to double down on them in order to make sure that in the competition with China, we take advantage of what the White House saw as our main strength, which is this alliance system. Take a look at what Colin Kahl, Deputy Secretary of Defense, said at one of his speeches in IISS. He said that the competition with China is not a competition between two states. It's a competition of alliances. coalitions. So we really need to bring them closer. That's why we suddenly saw that shift. And it manifested itself in Saudi Arabia in the sense that all the talk about pariah, all the talk about MBS is going to pay for how he's manipulated oil prices, all of that came to nothing. And we did not put pressure on him. Instead, we supported him in many different ways, including in Yemen. And then the question comes to your point. So why didn't the Saudis agree to it? Well, because once we were essentially bending over backwards for MBS, MBS was like, well, why don't you bend over a little bit more? I want formal security guarantees from you, the United States. I want you to commit American women and men to die for my country. So he's not going to meet the Biden team halfway unless he gets that. It's been one of the key demands of the Saudis that they've been repeating. And to Biden's credit, at least I have to say, we've so far not been in the mood of offering that. I mean, that would be a major, major change in U.S. posture. We would, because all of these other beliefs that we had to come to their defense were based on understandings, not formal treaties. Saudi Arabia is not a formal ally of the United States. It's a security partner, but there is no treaty agreement with them. That's what the Saudis are asking for right now. And there is a possibility that this whole normalization with Iran is part of MBS's negotiating tactic with the US, in which he's trying to raise the cost of the United States not offering him written security guarantees. But if he were to do so, and it would be truly formal, it would have to go through the Senate. And I very much doubt that the United States Senate would agree to such an agreement.
Yes. And then when it comes to Iran's position here, I mean, their potential new connection with China has to undercut any kind of upping of the Obama-era nuclear agreement, right? I mean, I know those talks have already been falling flat under Blinken, but any hope, my guess is that this dwindles those kinds of hopes since, you know, the United States' effort to isolate Iran took a blow with China's involvement here.
It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out on that issue. It has been on ice. It has been on ice for many different reasons. The last round of talks that took place in August of last year, the Iranians came in with last-minute demands that really, unfortunately, caused those talks to collapse. Then you had the uprisings in Iran, and then you had the midterms in the United States. So all of that led to a situation in which talks were put on ice. Then on top of that, the Iranians started supporting Russia in the war in Ukraine. And that all has led to a situation in which the cost for the Biden administration to go back in, the political cost to go back into the JCPOA has significantly increased, particularly the combination of Ukraine and the manner in which the Iranian government has treated its own people over the course of the last couple of months. On top of that, you've had a significant change of heart in Europe. Europe never saw the Iranian nuclear program as an immediate threat. The bigger threat was that we would go to war with Iran over the nuclear program. That was a threat to Europe. So the Europeans stepped in for the diplomacy in order to make sure that that scenario didn't happen. With Iran supporting Russia and the Europeans increasingly seeing Russia as an existential threat to the European order, suddenly their view of Iran has changed dramatically, and Ukraine takes way bigger priority than the nuclear program. So the political mood and the political space for this on the Western side has shrunk significantly. At the same time, there's been no indications that there's a more open attitude to it on the Iranian side. After this normalization deal, however, I think there are reasons to believe that it may potentially change, because this is a blow to any effort to isolate and contain and sanction Iran further. So one of the cards that the US had in their calculation of being able to, at some point when the US itself was ready, which doesn't seem to be the case right now, pressure the Iranians to come back to the table, has now been undermined with this and a normalization deal. On the other hand, the Chinese are stepping in and showing that just because the US doesn't have the political space to move forward diplomatically, doesn't mean that the Chinese are going to be sitting there on the sidelines and do nothing. So I think there is pressure momentum to do something, but it hasn't changed the political landscape in Washington, which on the US side has been one of the main obstacles. The Biden administration always wanted the deal, but was never really willing to pay the political price for it. If they did, they would have just gone in on day one instead of the strategy that they chose. The sad reality is that the political cost of going in has steadily increased since day one when he came into office. At that moment, it would have been the least politically costly step to take. Now it's much higher. And that's going to continue to remain a decisive factor on determining how the US reacts to this.
It's frustrating. Last question before I let you go. How does this help and alleviate the suffering of the people of Yemen, that we have some sort of normalization?
It hopefully will. At a minimum, we have to recognize that the Yemeni civil war has its own Yemeni roots. But Saudi Arabia and Iran has fueled that conflict by bringing their own rivalry into it. If they now withdraw it, that is good news. Is it sufficient to bring about a complete end to the civil war? We don't know. But it creates a significant opening and an opportunity for that to happen. There already is a truce. That truce has expired, but it's nevertheless largely been abided by. Will this give political momentum to move forward further and turn the truce into something more permanent? That would be one of the best outcomes if it were to happen from this normalization deal.
Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.